You're tuned into WestLINK.
Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who's watching out there. We appreciate your presence with us, and we're glad that you have joined us on another WestLINK program where we connect with real people to discuss real topics. It is a joy to have you this afternoon. I am your host, Pastor Fred Nichols. I have the privilege of serving as the lead pastor for this amazing Toronto West SDA Church, and we are planted to serve in the amazing neighborhood, the wonderful neighborhood of Rexdale. That's where our community is, that we love and that we have discovered that God has called us to, and so we are happy to serve them. But this afternoon we have come on to share with you and to discuss with you another real topic, and today it's an interesting one. We want to talk about social justice within the rank and file of the church and how the church can deal with it, and as a people, how we can also deal with issues of social justice. And today we've entitled the program 40 over 400 in 2020. It is, and I know you're out there saying, well, what is 40 over 400? It sounds like 1/10. It essentially is when you boil it down to its lowest common denominator. But 40 over 400 is the concept of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness that Israel had to go through once they were free of Egyptian bondage that they had served under for 400 years. And the process of healing that the Israelites went through in their quest to reacquaint themselves with their God, with their heritage, with their culture, and what the purpose that God had called them to. And sometimes when you are in bondage for a long time or enslaved to something for a long time, it's going to take you a moment to heal from that. And we want to talk about that healing process with us as a community, not just as Christians, but with our own ethnic backgrounds and how that affects us all. We want to acknowledge that there are so many people that watch the stream of all faiths, colors, creeds, and nations. This is in no way an attempt to exclude anyone, but we want to have an honest and open conversation about a lot of these things so that we can get to grow as a family. Joining us today are several individuals who have been called together to be the ones to contribute to this stream today. I want to first acknowledge Marsha Birkett. Marsha Birkett is one of our roses at Toronto West. It's so good to have her on the program. She is an educator by profession. She's teaching in the high school area, and Marsha is just one of those amazing people that once you meet her, you can't get her off your mind. She has a personality; it'll surprise you. Actually, she looks very quiet, but she is Greg Burkett's sister, and she taught him everything she knows. So, Marsha, amazing to have you on here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Pastor Nichols. Thank you for that interesting introduction.
And next we have on the program today, Alanna James. Alanna is one of our flowers also at Toronto West. She is one of our young people studying all the way out in Winnipeg. I don't know why she went that far to go get her education because we miss her around here, but it's good to have her on the program. Alanna, we welcome you. Thank you for being with us. We know you're in your junior year. You just got one more year to go before you get out of that place and come back to where things make sense. And so we welcome you to the program and thank you for your input today. God bless.
Thank you.
And next we have Quincy. Quincy is a friend of Alanna's actually, but he is a high schooler in the GTA area. He is a member of, I'm sorry, Quincy, tell me the church that you're a member of again.
I attend Harvest Worship Center, so it's in Brampton.
Amen. Harvest Worship Center in Brampton. He's a Brampton man. So Quincy's with us today, and Quincy is going to be contributing to us from the male young perspective. And he loves discussing these types of topics. And so, Quincy, we're happy to have you on today. Appreciate having you, brother.
Of course.
Then we have Sharon Clouden Woods. Sharon is a social worker by profession, and she has specialized. She specializes in areas of trauma and how to heal from trauma. And Sharon, it's amazing to have you on. I noticed your last name is Woods. You are related to Wensley Woods, I believe. And We can't apologize enough for that. But it's good to have you on the stream as well. We appreciate your presence with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Pastor.
Amen. And then last but not least is our brother, Myron James. And Myron is coming to us all the way from Gainesville, Florida. First of all, we want to apologize that you live in the United States. To make sure you understand that things are a little bit different here in Canada. So it's good to have you with us, Myron. Myron is a father. He is someone who's raising 4 children. He is a black man living in Florida during these times when there's so much racial tension happening down in the United States. Myron is an electrician by trade. And we're sure he's going to shock us with a lot of his statements today. But it's good to have you on, Myron. Thank you for being with us. All right. He might not be able to hear us. He needs to refresh probably. But it's good to have him on with us today. So I just want to welcome everybody. Before we get into our subject matter and start discussing this wonderful issue of social justice, our response to it, how we are affected by it, and how things are happening around us that involve it, I want to take us to a song that kind of speaks to this issue that we're about to discuss today, right up the alley. And it's a song called "Deliver Us." Some of you might remember it, but take a gander at it now, and may God bless you as you listen.
I can give, but this chance that you may live, I pray we'll meet again if He will deliver us. Hear our prayer, deliver us from these famished years and slaves we've grown too old to stand. Deliver us. There's a land you promised us. To the promise and from the bondage.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. We want to first of all say thank you for that song. It's an amazing song done by one individual. So we appreciate that, and it speaks to where we're going right now, the Israelite experience. But we want to talk about how that story in the Bible affects our experience as a people when it comes to slavery and the issue of slavery. We want to know how that 40 by 400 affects the transatlantic slave movement, how that affected us. And so I want to ask the question of the panelists today: how do we connect that experience that Israel had with the experience that African Americans had, or that Black people had in general, with the transatlantic slave movement? Marsha, let's throw it to you.
Okay. Well, when we look at, first of all, the amount of time that the Israelites were enslaved is 400 years. And that's a similarity with our enslavement, was 400 years as well. They went through a lot with their enslavement. We can argue that they were subjected to emotional abuse, physical abuse, which was the same for us as Black people. And from this transatlantic slave trade, we were subjected to abuse as well. And then the slavery was intergenerational. So you were born into slavery. The Israelites were born into slavery, as was our people. And the differences start to happen, though, where we look at the Israelites still were able to maintain their sense of a nation. They all lived together in one area in Goshen, so they maintained this sense of a nation. We as a people were taken from different parts of West Africa. We didn't have that sense of maintaining who we were as a people group. We were taken to different places. We don't know where we were taken from. That was all taken from us. Our names were taken from us. Our identities were taken from us. We had no idea of these things, whereas the Israelite people were able to maintain a sense of that. So at the end of their 400 years of enslavement, then they had this 40 years of wandering. And you remember that they had to wander because they didn't have faith to go into Canaan, that they were able to conquer it. So they wandered for 40 years. And during that 40 years, as you mentioned in your introduction, Pastor Fred, they were taught how to love God and how to serve him again, and how to reconnect with him. And God did them as a nation, as a people, all together there as one. When slavery was done for us as a people, and it was abolished in various times, depending on where you were enslaved, there wasn't that time of us together wandering as a people, trying to relearn and have access again to our identities and who we were as a people. So that's where the similarities end. We weren't able to identify as a people. And I want to just say here too, the Israelites to this day still look back at their enslavement as a way of learning from it, hence to the Passover, right? And the Seder plate, where the things on the plate remind them of different experiences that they went through and how they overcame. We as a people, because of what was done to us as an identity, a lot of us still struggle at looking back at the slavery experience and learning and growing from it. When we don't look back at it, when we don't access it, then we can't learn. And it's difficult for us to move forward. So their 40 years of wandering, I submit that we're still wandering because we didn't have that experience that they had of the 40 years of wandering.
Yeah, and that's an amazing point that you bring up, because I literally never thought of it that way before. When you talk about how the differences that separate their experience from ours, right? The fact that even though they were in slavery, God kept all of them in Goshen. And when he brought them out, he delivered all of them together. And so they were a nation in the wilderness. The thing about them being a nation in the wilderness, like you said it rightly, is that God has a chance to encounter them and interact with them holistically. And that holistic engagement, I think, is what heals them. But notice that it takes 40 years to get over 400 years of slavery. And even after that 40 years, they still didn't get it 100%. But they were able to heal enough from it. I think the difference in the Black experience is that Black folk, wherever they were enslaved, and because they were spread out so far on this Western hemisphere, it's as if they when coming out of slavery, and they experienced their freedom from slavery at different points in time as well. We know, I think, that Haiti was the first country to receive their independence because of the fight that they had for their freedom, and then it went down from there. But we realize that this experience that Blacks have had with enslavement is still affecting us. We still haven't had our 40 years. Our 40 years is not up yet, right? And I know that there's some people who will say, well, the reality is that it's been 40 years after the civil rights movement by Martin Luther King. It's been 40 years after the abolition, the abolishment of slavery and so forth. But the problem is that we have not had our moment of justice or of recognition for that. And there's some people that make light of the slavery that we've encountered. I want to know from anybody else on the panel, how are you encountering and experiencing and still affected by what happened to our predecessors, and how that has shaped the dynamic of our families in today. Sharon, if you care.
Well, I think, Marsha, thank you so much for sharing that insightful information, because it is really good to understand the difference between the two, right? And so that's our starting point right there. We have, a group of people that has been stuck in this wilderness searching, right? And so right now, we are a group of people still searching, but we've been traumatized for such a long time, historically and right now as well. And so we bear that, right? And so people who are often traumatized, when they start to talk, they talk about, feeling ashamed, right? Feeling alienated, feeling very fearful, feeling grief, feeling depressed, anxious. And so we need to listen to that when people are speaking, because we need to understand where is that coming from when they are having to retell that story, but maybe they're having to retell it because it's not so much that it happened so far ago, but it's happening right now. And so they're seeing that and they're feeling that. The brain is really interesting, because whatever you experience there, you're also going to feel it. It doesn't know the difference, right? And so that's how people will start to talk about, having these chronic illnesses, and they're feeling like their body's breaking down. So we're seeing that being manifested with our people when they talk to us, when they come to us, even when they are communicating with each other, with their family members and with their children. And so we need to find a way to be really collective, right? Just like the Israelites had that opportunity to stay together and to talk, right? To debunk some of that information, to debunk their experiences, right? And to talk about what are the next steps. We haven't been able to do that because, as Marsha disclosed, we were separated, and that wasn't by chance. That was very intentional, right? They separated us so that way we couldn't communicate, we couldn't bond, we couldn't have shared experiences, we couldn't talk about our pains and our suffering, and we couldn't also learn to embrace ourselves and learn how to get out of that bondage, whether it was a physical bondage or an emotional bondage.
Yeah, and we couldn't even have traditions, right? Because that's also important for connecting with culture. I want to ask this point now towards our two youngest panelists, because I believe that when I was younger, one of the things that I recognized was the fact that I was told stories about the past and so forth, but I didn't really connect them until I had life experience that began to help me to understand some of the stories that my father and my mother and people around me had told me. So in your experience, both Alanna and Quincy, in your experience, do you feel the weight and the gravity of this issue of the transatlantic slave movement on your own experience in this modern age, or are we too far past that in order for it to be really impactful on your generation?
I think it's very impactful. I think now we think that since we are the future and we are the present currently, that we need to push forward. And I feel like we're taking a lot of the weight on ourselves, thinking that we are the ones who need to change everything because it is our time. And I think that can have a hard toll on a lot of youth in general. That's all.
Okay, Quincy?
I definitely think it's different, but it's definitely still relevant to our time and the experiences that we have. And it's not the same experiences that the older people may have had, but for our generation, we still experience like different senses of racism and like the things that we see in our time. So the social justice issues that are going on in the world, and we have to take that experience and what we've learned to make that change, because we have to have it for our future children to live out the lives that we want them to live, you know?
It's interesting you brought up that word racism, because we live in Canada. There's no racism in Canada. It can't be racism in Canada. But I want to hear from Myron. Myron, you are our American lamb to the slaughter, so to say. You are here with us, and we want you to bring that perspective for us, because we talk about, when we mention racism here in Canada, it really is a notion that is not as connected to us, because there's always this cry that we don't have as much racial tension here in Canada. But I want to get the perspective from you as a person living in the United States of America, in Florida itself. How are you coping with what's going on down there now, and the constant reminder, I would say over the last few years, the constant reminder of this racial divide within the United States? How are you coping with all of that? Okay, I think we're having a problem hearing you. I don't know if you're muted or what. All right, let's move on while they work out that technical difficulty. I wanna. Is he back with us? All right, I want to work out. Let's work that technical difficulty. Let's make sure his mic is working, because I really want to hear his perspective. But this issue of what happened in the transatlantic slave movement connecting with us today, it's interesting how it still connects with us today, and that all of our experience is different. I would say the majority of our membership at Toronto West is a West Indian population, or come from West Indian heritage. And there was a mentor that I had once who told me this, and it was so true. Or I found it to be true. He was an African American man living in the city of Chicago. An amazing mentor. His name was Dr. Charles D. Joseph, and we were having a discussion one time about the difference between the West Indian experience in slavery and the African American experience in slavery. And one of the things he pointed out to me, he said, if you had a West Indian person working in a job alongside an African American person working in a job, he said the difference was, and these were his words, the difference was, he said that for the African American experience, in their mind, they would say to themselves, man, one of these days I want to be the manager of this place. And the difference in the West Indian mind was the West Indian would say, man, one of these days I want to own this place. And he said the reason why there's a difference in that thinking was because, he said, West Indian folk experienced their freedom from slavery much earlier than the African American did. So we have this ability to be removed much more from slavery than they are, whereas their experience is far more fresh than ours is. Do you think that's true or not true? Anybody on the panel?
Well, if I may, I think that it is to an extent true, but I think another piece of the puzzle would be that a lot of times in the Caribbean, we saw people fighting for independence from their colonizers. So once they gained independence from their colonizers, although it was still a struggle, and we still saw some of the residual effects of slavery and colonization, you could see people in positions of authority who were the same color as you, who looked like you. Your teachers at school looked like you. The people in the banks looked like you. Your prime minister looked like you. In places like North America, Canada, and the US, that's often not the case. I know growing up in Canada, for me, it was different because I didn't always see people who looked like me. I remember 2 teachers in high school who were Black, right? And so you don't have those aspirations because you don't see it as much in these countries. Not that there weren't residual effects from slavery and from colonization in the Caribbean, but people had an opportunity to see themselves reflected. Now when we look at the US with Kamala Harris, we see young Black girls who are getting excited because they see somebody who looks like them in a position that she's in. So for the American experience that your mentor was talking about, I think that could perhaps be one of the contributing factors, that they didn't always see themselves reflected in places of power.
Go ahead, Sharon. You had something you wanted to say as well.
There's also, and thank you for that, Marsha, because there's also a sense of hopelessness that goes with that, right? I mean, if we feel like we don't see anyone that looks like us or is achieving anything, we wouldn't even know what to achieve or aspire to if we don't see what that looks like, right? And so once we can build some sense of hopefulness into our community, and once we can work collaboratively with each other, right? And I think that's one of the things with the islands. They were able to work together as a collective unit and they were able to, aspire and work on their strengths, and they were able to teach each other. We are not given that opportunity, right? And when we are, the selective few that are given that opportunity, and we're taught to be divided amongst each other, and they continue to separate each other. So when some people are taught, right, and others are not, then we get angry with each other and we fight each other. We don't work as a unit. And so we have to remember that in that environment, it might be smaller in comparison to here, but really they work as a unit. And so when they see progress, just like our children here, when they see progress, they will know what that looks like, what that smells like, what that tastes like. And we nurture it, right? And that's how we excel. And there's something to say about education, right? So if you're not given that opportunity, you're not going to know what's out there. You at least have to get in there and get a taste of it. And that's how you'll grow.
Yes, you are so right. I want to go back to this thing that was mentioned, though, when Quincy mentioned it about the racism that he experiences here in Canada. I mean, we got to talk about this issue since we're in Canada. We can't always be referring back to the United States for the experience of racism, and so we have to talk about the issue as it pertains to us here in Canada as Canadians. There are a lot of us who believe that racism is much more watered down here or doesn't exist at all. And there's a clip that I want to play for us now that speaks to this reality. It's taken from a podcast, and I want you to listen now as we play this clip.
Do me a favor. Raise your hand if the first thing that you learned in school about slavery in Canada was the Underground Railroad. Now, keep your hand in the air if that was also the last thing you learned. Earlier this year, police killings of unarmed Black people and the resulting protests across the world showed us just how unequal our society still is. But even then, even as protesters took to the streets in Canadian cities, some people were quick to point out that we're better than that it hasn't historically been that bad in Canada. And really, hasn't it? Or have we just not been taught enough about it? So what we want to try to examine.
Now, when I heard that podcast, I was one who mentally, in my mind, raised my hand when that man said that if we were taught about the racial issue in Canada being about the Underground Railroad, I raised my hand in my head. And when he said, keep your hand up if that's all you learned, I still had my hand up because that is true. I was young enough. When I came to this country, I was young enough to still, before I went through high school. And so going through high school, that was part of the narrative in high school. And then we had teachers that would teach us about the slavery in the United States, but never touched on how the tensions of racism affect us here in Canada. In our congregation at Toronto West, we are blessed to have individuals in it who can trace their roots back to being ancestors or descendants of people who came from the Underground Railroad. Their relatives ended up in Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia and places like that. And for generations, they've had relatives living out there. And we've seen those documentaries of those individuals. But the narrative here in this country is as if we have never experienced racism, that the person coming here doesn't experience racism because racism is not a part of the Canadian context. So I want to know, is racism a part of the Canadian context?
Definitely. And, that's often, and when you talk to our neighbors south of the border too, that's often the narrative. There wasn't slavery in Canada because the Underground Railroad ended there. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, but there was slavery in Canada. It's interesting to note slavery was abolished in Canada just 27 years before the Civil War started in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we did have slavery in Canada. The Underground Railroad ended here because slavery was abolished earlier. But once people arrived here, it wasn't all roses and golden streets of gold. There were trials, there were problems. There's a long history of what happened to people when they came here. We had segregated schools. The last segregated school in Ontario closed in 1965. And in Nova Scotia in the 1980s. So there was segregation there, and there still is racism, and not just anti-Black racism. We look at the residential schools for the Indigenous people. We look at Japanese internment. We look at Chinese head taxes. We look at all those other things that contribute to the racial climate of Canada. And there definitely still is racism. I saw someone put a comment that it's just not as open. And that is pretty dangerous, because in light of the George Floyd stuff that happened earlier this year, and we saw people reacting all over the world, including right here in Canada, we saw that people were speaking out, and with the racial climate being transferred, it felt like it was being transferred here to Canada, but it already was here. There are names of people who were experienced police brutality in Toronto. Blacks are 20 times more likely to be shot by police than any other group, right? So we already had it here, and the fact that our premier can say that there is no systemic racism, and then later retract that statement, goes to show that people are just blind to it. But we who live it, we know and we experience that it is here. So there is systemic racism, there was slavery here, and there continues to be racism experienced here in Canada.
Sure. And we have to point out too that racism is not just something here in Canada that happens to Blacks. A few weeks ago, we had a whole show here on WestLINK that talked about the Indigenous plight and what happened, how the government of Canada's response to the Indigenous peoples here in Canada, who were here before anybody else got here, and how they have been affected by the systemic racism, the intentional systemic racism that took place against them. So it's not just Blacks that have experienced that here. It's a number of different cultural groups that have experienced that here. We think of the Asians that come across, and all those other individuals that come across. We all experience it to some degree, sense or form. I want to know, how do you feel the tension is, Quincy? How do you feel the tension is here in Canada as a young man living in Brampton, close to the GTA, and coming into the city itself and dealing with that everyday grind and whatever? How do you feel when you experience racism, or have you experienced racism to the extent where it affected you as an individual?
For myself, it was crazy because recently, I had my first racist experience, because I was one of those people before where I was like, oh, racism isn't as prevalent in Canada as in America. But recently in school, I had my first racist experience, and I was like, wow, this still exists in 2020 after all the stuff that we've been through. It's how would this still exist? And it was just a crazy experience for myself, where it's this is something that we really need to change for the mindset of different people. And I like how we talked about the different racism, because a lot of the times when we think of racism, we think of Black people, but then there's also Japanese internment camps, and then the Aboriginal residential schools that we have to talk about as well. So there's people that till this day Aboriginals experience the marginalization between the communities, so that we often just disregard what they go through and then focus on the issues that we have at hand. So there are definitely still racist experiences that everyone has, and I guarantee that each and every one of us has a testimony that we could attest to for that. So.
Sure. Myron, you have relatives here in Canada. You spent time here in Canada when you were younger, and you still come across every now and then. Well, not recently, but hopefully the border will be open soon. You can come across soon. But how do you compare how the United States deals with racial issues? Is it better to be in a country where it's more open and you can kind of address it better, or is the Canadian context, you find the Canadian context so different that it's not even noticeable to an extent? But how do you feel about that, and what's your experience?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, my first racist experience took place in Canada when I was younger. Mm-hmm. It's only recently, since who's become president, that racism has kind of boiled over, to where it is right now. I mean, we being in America, it's there. Like someone said, it was kind of covertly there, but now that the rhetoric in America now it seems to be so divisive. Well, it is so divisive and divisive that people are just they're, I guess, emboldened to just hate, and it's incredible to just see these are people that you shop with, some people you work with, And some people, and I'm not saying it's all white people. Racism is coming from people you wouldn't even believe. It's coming from races who are picking up on this rhetoric and saying thing about immigrants shouldn't be coming, and it's just so disturbing. And being a black man here in America, to see what happened to George Floyd and everyone being able to witness that. We've been saying these things for years. I mean, it's only now that it's on video and people are actually seeing. But I mean, I grew up in New York, and when stop and frisk was real, and you could just be. I've been stopped and frisked just because, just because I'm a black man, and I think now that it's boiled to the point where it is, it's kind of a good thing, because some people who said that it did not exist or who did not want to see it, they have no choice but to see it now. I mean, if you deliberately say that systemic racism doesn't exist, or racism doesn't exist, or police brutality doesn't exist, then you're just toting the company line at that point.
Sure. I want to ask the panel, and thank you for that contribution, Myron. I want to ask the panel and the entire panel the residual effects, because as you're talking, Myron, it came back to my mind that sometimes racism and the whole issue of slavery and being enslaved can have residual effects, and we've just been living it for so long that we find it normal. To be racially profiled is normal. To be spoken to in such a condescending manner is normal, and it really is not normal. But we've just come to accept it as a society. I'm not just even going to say as black people, but as a society in North America, we've just come to accept it. And are there residual effects of racism that affect us today that we're kind of blind to until they actually become very explicit? Before we answer, I want to play our second clip from this podcast detailing a situation that happened in Montreal not too long ago. Between a couple that's an interracial couple. It was a white man that had a black girlfriend, and they were taking a stroll down a Montreal street. And there was an incident that happened with police. And I want to play this clip so that we're all in context and we understand it. But this happened literally within the past couple of years. So I want to play that clip so we can hear it, and then we can move on with our discussion.
But what about the smaller legacies that Canada's history with slavery still has in this country? Legacies like, say, the reaction that many interracial couples still get from police, from people on the sidewalk in this country today. We've seen the legacy of slavery in police violence and in the protests that follow it. But there's an invisible legacy too. And are we going to confront that or not? What happened to Tayana Jacques and Brian Mann?
From what I have read and seen of their interviews, they were out on a Saturday morning stroll going to get coffee. And I should point out that Tayana is a black woman and Brian is a white man, and they're romantically involved. They're a couple. So they were out for a Saturday morning stroll in the Plateau, the very trendy Plateau, Mount Royal neighborhood of Montreal. I think they were laughing and talking as people normally would who know each other and having a good day. And this elicited the notice of the Montreal police, who stopped them in quite, allegedly, when they describe it, violently, stopped them, detained them, handcuffed them. Tayana was questioned about drug use out of the blue with no kind of rationale for that kind of probing or questioning. And Brian, I believe, was kicked in the knee and pepper sprayed. What sparked my interest and curiosity was that, for me, I think what triggered the violent interest of the Montreal police and their violent actions, and I should say too that I believe by the end 2 more police cruisers were called. So, and this is what amounts to, other people have gone on the record of saying this is what amounts to a municipal bylaw infraction of being noisy.
So now that we have that as a context and as a backdrop, I want to ask, do you think there's a legacy that we're experiencing of this racial tension here in Canada? Does it exist? And do police forces up here have the same mandate as they were created for down in the United States way back when slavery was an issue? We know that historically, police forces came about in the different towns and neighborhoods where they were. Initially, they started as militia groups that were hired to hunt down runaway slaves, and that's how the genesis of policing and the modern day policing that we have today has come about. Does that exist here? We heard Marsha say that 27 years before the United States received it, that Canada had gotten rid of slavery. But were there still police groups that were created for that issue? And how does that affect us and the legacy of that affecting us? And as we're discussing, we invite our viewing public. If you care to send in your questions or comment on what you're hearing, please do so. Don't feel shy. We're not going to bite. We want to engage you as well in the discussion what we're having. But any of the panelists really, please talk to us now about how you feel that legacy, this aftermath of the trauma, is still affecting us today when it comes to our modern day and the context that we live in.
If we could just think about parents right now having to sit and have a conversation about potential harassment by the police. It may not have been something you would have thought about before, but now in light of, and I'm talking about in Canada, not so much in the United States, but now that in light of this awareness, right, where it's like we've been in the dark for many of us, and now we are in the light. Because those who've had horrific traumatizing experience were silenced. They don't talk about it, right? And it's hard for them to talk about it. But now, as we're coming together as a community, we're really being more outspoken, and we're given permission to do that, right? And so once we do this, imagine sitting down and having a conversation with your 13-year-old, right? And say when you go outside, if you have a potential engagement with a police officer, this is what you say. This is how you act. This is how you sit. Or if you're in the car, make sure that your identification is placed in a certain place that they can see. It has to be visible. That in itself, as little and as simple as it may sound, and it's important, that in itself is traumatizing, right? And then at the same point, the children do need to hear about this. We do need to teach them, and it needs to be age appropriate, but they're also being traumatized as well to a degree. So we have now this shared experience that we hold within ourselves. All of a sudden, we have children, when they see these police officers, they freeze up. Right. And so that's what trauma does to you. It allows you to be numb. It allows you to freeze up and it silences you, whether it's emotionally or physically. So I do think that, we're seeing more of this and we're feeling it more often. And I'm really glad that we have this time to have a conversation about it as well.
Yeah. Myron, I saw you were itching to say something. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I was. The way that it's affecting us today, we got to realize that racism is something that's learned. So I mean, it's been handed down from generation to generation. Even though slavery doesn't exist anymore, the mentality still exists. Look, someone just commented the mentality of how people view us as a people is still passed down. I mean, just recently. Here in America, they had the movie Black Panther that came out, and it was celebrated. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but I mean, this is just recent. You understand what I'm saying? So throughout in Hollywood, we've been depicted as criminals or drug dealers or drug users. Even in movies that they portray Africans, the Africans were white. Like, I mean. So I mean, the fact that all of this stuff is coming to light now it's encouraging, and at the same time it's kind of sad, because I mean, look where slavery was abolished, and we're here in 2020 and we're still dealing with all of these issues that originated so long ago.
Yeah. I want to ask this too, because we're talking about in general society. And how the effects of what this has caused to us as a people group and so forth. But we're all Christians on this panel. Certainly, racism does not exist in the church. Certainly, it does not. I couldn't be more sarcastic. My words couldn't drip with any more sarcasm, even if I asked the Lord to bless me with more sarcasm. But certainly, racism doesn't exist in the church, or does it? In all of our experiences here, are there times when we are surprised, whether at the racial undertone in the church or at the response or the lack of response of the church towards some of these racist issues that happen, or social justice issues that happen? Do we feel the church is too silent? Do we think that it's overactive? Do we think that it doesn't address it? Are we ignoring it? Like, how do you feel about how your church deals with the context of racism and injustice, and then dealing with how their response to social justice is? How do you guys feel about that?
Well, when we look at, first of all, the Eurocentric perspective from which Christianity is presented, that itself lends itself to people being racist toward us, even as they call themselves Christians. And so we become marginalized as Black people within a secular society, and then as well within Christendom, right? And so you have this view, this Eurocentric view of Christianity. So there are propensities toward racism. Of course, there's racism in the church, and I know your words were dripping with sarcasm, and we see it all the time. How many of you have been to a church that used to be predominantly white? Now, when others started to visit that church and attend there, and now all of a sudden, the racial profile, so to speak, of the church has changed, right? And there's so many instances of racism within Christianity as well as within Adventism. But something for me personally, I think is really important to note is that our denomination, William Miller, our denomination came out of the Millerite movement. William Miller was an abolitionist. He spoke up against slavery. He spoke up against, what was going on in the southern states of the U.S. Ellen White, James White, all of those people were abolitionists. And a lot of times the things that we see with regard to those people are quotes and things that are taken out of context to make it seem as though they were racist. They had difficulty traveling to the South because of the message that they were bringing. They were talking up against slavery in the South and against the things that were happening in the South. Ellen White spoke out very loudly about this, the Civil War. And she said, the Lord is not with the South. Right? But we don't often hear that. And so the people within the rank and file of our organization, Black, white, otherwise, don't know this. And so we find that even within our denomination, within our organization, certain groups may find that they may think of themselves as better and may even be using spirit of prophecy to show this when it's totally not the case. And that's not our church's history. And it's really frustrating and really sad that within a Christian organization, because not just our denomination, but within Christianity in general, people still misuse the words of the Bible, still misuse passages of scripture to justify the oppression of a particular group.
Absolutely. Quincy, how do you feel about how racism is addressed in your particular congregation? First of all, my curiosity for you is what is the makeup of your congregation? Is it a multicultural congregation, or is it a predominantly Black congregation? Like, what's the makeup of your congregation, number one? And then number two, how do you feel your church responds to these issues of that affect us today?
Definitely at my church, it's something that it's one of our core values to be multicultural. So we're an intentionally multicultural church. So there's a bunch of different races and cultures in our church that combine to make one church. And in our church, it's something that our pastors decided to address. We had a series about it, just talking about social injustices in general. Just being silent no more as Christians, not just sitting back and just holding our perspective and letting the world deal with it, but standing up as Christians and bringing our Christian perspective to deal with the different social injustices that are going on in the world. For myself, it's something that I've always grown up in, because I've always grown up in this church. So I've always seen the different the different cultures and the multiculturalism. And I think that's how it's supposed to be. And that's how it's going to be in heaven as well. So just realizing that the different cultures combining to bring one church and uniting together is just something that we need for sure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Myron.
I just wanted to say, you asked the question, should the church pick up the issue of against racism? I think I've heard people complain a lot about the Adventist church. and I guess their unwillingness to speak up against what's happening. In the church's defense, I would say that the mission of the church as a whole, this is like the general embodiment of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is the spreading of the gospel in these last days, and that's what But I'm not saying that individual congregations or people within the denomination should not take up this the issue or the fight. But we can't sit back and wait for the church as a general, body to take up that mantle. I just wanted to say that.
Sure. I'm gonna say something here that because I was born in this church and raised in this church, and I'm working for this church. And if it were not for the mission of the church, then I don't know if I'd be in the church, to be honest with you. But I want to say something here because I think that one of the things that we don't do as a denomination is we don't address what happens to us and what happens internally with us. And this is in Christianity in general, right? There are things about Christianity that are not God-driven, that are there because it's just because of the sinfulness of man. The church is flawed not because God is not a good God. The church is flawed because we're in it, and we have to admit that. That's why the church is flawed, and every church is flawed because of human interaction. But the truth is, I think that sometimes these things come to the forefront as a church, because when society begins to experience some of these negative things, we sometimes don't deal with it as a church because these things exist within our context and we haven't yet addressed them. And I think one of the most potent things for healing is when we tell the story about how we have been affected or how some of these things have caused these issues. Trauma can't be dealt with until it's expressed, and so we have to find a way to honestly say to ourselves as a church that these things are happening. I know I've had experiences of it within the context of the church. I've had a conference president look at me and tell me that because I'm marrying a black woman, that if I marry this black woman, I don't have any place in his conference. See what I'm saying? And so there are things that have happened to all of us, I would say, that the church doesn't address, that the church doesn't deal with, and sometimes we are pushed to say something when we should be saying something before we're pushed to do it. And so I want to know how you feel about that, and do you think that the church has some work to do on that level? I think it does, but how do you feel about it, Sharon? Go ahead.
Well, I think definitely, when you talk about what's going on in the society, remember, we are also part of society. And I think sometimes people forget that, right? We seem to talk about what goes on in the church is separate from what goes outside of the church. And really and truly, we're all the same, because once we leave that door, once we open that door, we are part of what's going on out there. And so we're part of the problem, we're part of the solution as well. In order for this to not necessarily come to an end, but in order for us to really heal properly, like anyone who is being traumatized, and we all have trauma in our life. We can't assume that because someone looks a certain way that they're traumatized and I'm not, because I'm dressed up and I ate and I'm healthy and I slept well. We all have dealt with trauma to some degree. So how do we do this? How do we heal? We have to get together. We have to form a correlation together, and we need to talk about it. We can't just assume that because we weren't stopped by the police or because we didn't have this particular experience that we are not subjected to it, right? So we have to really start communing together. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about it, how it affects us as an individual, how it affects us as a community, how it's impacting us as a church community as well, and what do we intend to do about it. We need to have groups. We need to have just put the information out there. Technology is vast. Look what the platforms that we're using. We have to find ways to get that message out there so people are aware that, first of all, they're not alone, right? This is not something that's isolated, that they do have a voice and they are validated by their experiences. And we're going to support each other. We're going to have to learn to support each other and stop putting each other down, because When you think that it's only happening to your neighbor and you leave and it happens to you, that's when we become surprised. We shouldn't be surprised anymore, right? We should be always aware, but we have to be proactive and we need to start planning before things happen. It's like money management, right? Don't wait until you're broke. Start putting away, a penny at a time, a nickel at a time. Start teaching your children right now to invest, whatever the case is. So it's the same way with our lives, and our lives are valuable. So let's start planning now what we could do for the future. Like I said before, in order to get where you want to be, you have to address where you are right now and plan on how you're going to get there.
Marsha, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Sharon so eloquently said just now. And I think part of the problem, too, is within our own Black congregations. And I'm going to say it, within our own congregation at church, sometimes when we bring up issues about racial problems and things that we need to discuss with our youth and get them prepared to handle situations that may come up, some people don't want us to talk about it. It's like, just let's bury it, let's cover it up. And we can't. As a Black congregation, we need to speak up. And it doesn't mean that we're less Christian because we're speaking up and we're saying we're not for this injustice. Jesus did so much for social justice in his time on earth, and we rarely speak about that part of his ministry, but he did do so. Who did Jesus? So Jesus did not hesitate to look out for women, lepers, sick, sinners, the tax collectors, anyone who was downtrodden. Jesus was there for. So we need to not be afraid. And I think sometimes maybe as a congregation, so much of immigrants, we think, oh, we've come to this country, maybe we need to be a little shy and cower a little and not say too much and just thank everybody for the things they've allowed us to have. But we need to speak up. And as Sharon said, we need to invest in our youth and let them know that they have a voice and they have a community where they can come and discuss these issues that if they don't discuss, will boil over and will fester.
Right.
And may I just add that has to be, they need to feel safe doing it. So we need to ensure that they feel that we're going to trust them, we're going to validate them, but that they are safe when they come to us.
I want to throw this to the girl with the fiery red strands just for a second. Alanna, you stated last night when we were in the rehearsal, you stated last night, that when you were living in this GTA bubble, you were going to a Black church, you were attending, you had Black friends, you're doing all this, but you're now in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg is Winnipeg. We love the folk in Winnipeg, but talk to us about how you find the experience in Winnipeg different than the GTA, because you did say something to us last night, but how do you find that experience, and how much more are you noticing things that you may not have noticed before because of the protection, quote unquote, of the bubble that you lived in here in Toronto?
It's very different. I'm going to use my job, looking for a job, as an example. My hair is red and it's red, it's full locked, and looking for a job with red hair is just out of this world. No matter, you have to be conscious of every little thing you're doing, because in Toronto, I feel like it's more accepted, it's more known, it's more shown into the world, versus in Winnipeg, where it's kind of everybody looks a certain way and is shaped in a square, basically. So just knowing, having to go into a place and say, okay, I can't have this hair, I have to do this hair, I have to brush it up, I can't have baby hairs, because if I have baby hairs, they might think something is different, and just trying to fit into that box. And I think it's very different from when I was in Toronto. It slapped me in my face. So.
And I'm sure it's eye-opening too, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. There's a comment that I saw Angela Samaj put up that I want to address briefly. I don't know if we have that comment. We can just throw that back up. Yeah, she said, and this is the comment she said, and that is why so many African Americans refuse to accept Christ Jesus, because the Bible has been used as a tool to subdue us, and stating that God is for slavery. And she's absolutely right. Historically, the scriptures have been used to justify slavery. But I want to point out here that I think that it's a mismanagement of scripture from several perspectives. But one of the main ones is the fact that the Bible was not written by white folk. We have to remember that. And I'm not saying that to put down any Caucasians that may be watching. I want to be realistic here in the genre. That the fact that the Bible was written by authors, and the books of the Bible were written by authors who were not Caucasian, who were a mixed multitude. They said that the mixed multitude came out of Egypt. And so there were mixed individuals throughout the 2,000 years that the scriptures were written. There were mixed individuals, Black and other ethnic groups that wrote the Bible. And so to take the biblical reference as if it's only from a Caucasian perspective is a misuse of scripture when it was oppressed people that wrote the Bible, people that lived under grave oppression. And they wrote from the underdog perspective, understanding that even though there were limitations to their existence and challenges to their existence, they still served a God who was capable of carrying them through. And so the narrative of the Bible is a piece of literature that talks about how to overcome not just sin, but in life in general, and the use of that. And there are a couple of scriptures I want to put up on the screen that historically racial folk who buy into racist tendencies have used to justify their racism or justify enslavement of others other than themselves. This is one from Colossians 3:22. It says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord." The New Testament there is talking about, it says slaves, and the context is right, but it also can be translated servants. And one of the things we have to recognize is that anyone who was hired and employed by somebody else was seen as a servant or a slave, and they would be paid for their work. But they were seen as servants or slaves. You are here to serve this person because they hired you to do whatever. I'm not saying that slavery didn't exist back then, but we have to understand the context in which it was written. And we can't just take one text out of the Bible, look at it, and think that it justifies what we would like it to justify. We have to look at it within its context. And so when it talks about that, all it simply is talking about is you who are in others' employments, do your job so diligently, whether the person that has hired you is good to you or not, because remember that the way that you do your job, the diligence with which you do your job, still glorifies God in how you do what you do. And so we have to understand the language of the Bible with that. But how do you feel about the use of scripture? And here's another one from 1 Peter 2:18. "The servants be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." In other words, serve the masters well, even the ones who don't treat you well. And I'm sure that is an experience that all of us have, where you've had that one boss that was just so on your case and that you didn't like and that caused you pain on the job and so forth. Like you had that one person, but the Bible here even says, even to that person, render still an attitude, a godlike and Christ-like attitude. And that can be challenging sometimes when you're a child of God, because you want to come out of them, you want to come out of your flesh and be able to address them that way. But you still have to do that. Now, the context of using scripture to subdue slaves is real. We've seen people do that. But how do you feel about that? And how do you meet that challenge as an individual, where you think the Bible is telling you to submit to your masters, but how do you do that and still keep your dignity? I want to know that.
I think one of the things is to remember that as an individual, you are valuable. You are of value. And when people are being told or that they are nothing, they're worthless, they're devalued, that they're invisible, right? They're not seen, and they're powerless. When that's happening on an ongoing basis, it just makes you feel awful about yourself, right? And I mean, I'm quite sure everyone who's listening could put your hands up and said, when was the time, have you ever felt devalued by someone or something that they said? Right. And absolutely. So it makes you feel angry. It makes you feel, just like you just want to cry. You just want to just stay silent for a bit. So we have to remember and tell yourself, I am a valuable person. I am someone that is meaningful, right? I'm someone that can give to others as well. I'm not to be used or abused, and I'm not to be blamed for anything that someone else did to me, right? So I think Black people, the slaves then, the slaves now, in today's society, have to remember that you are valuable and you can get through this.
Right.
And I also think we need to remember that meek does not equate weak, right? So even if we're having a meek attitude, it does not mean that we cannot speak up for our rights and for what is best for us and for what's in our interests, right? So I don't think sometimes when we take those passages, just because you're doing what you're supposed to do does not mean you're weak. And just because you're not yelling and screaming does not mean you're not speaking up for yourself and asserting yourself and saying, as Sharon said, that you're a person of value and I'm not going to take this from you, right?
Yes. Go ahead.
I
Myron.
just quickly, I just heard Marsha say something about meek and weak. Once heard someone say, if you think that being meek is weak, try being meek for a week.
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. Every people group, I think, that has experienced oppression. When you talk about the Jews and the Holocaust, when you talk about the Crusades of the 1600s that were sweeping across Europe, when you talk about the colonization of North America and what the Portuguese and the Spaniards did and the British did to the indigenous peoples of North America and the Caribbean islands, every people group that has ever experienced oppression, I find, has come to a place where they must rely on a deity in order to get them out of the trouble that they're in, right? And we have turned to God in so many different times when we feel as if we have no other place to turn. One of the things that I heard once is that our inabilities becomes God's responsibilities. That when we are incapable of getting ourselves out of a jam, God is the one that we must turn to because He takes over at that point in time. But we're incapable of accomplishing, He has to take over at that point in time. And I think that every people group that has experienced oppression has come to a point where they have relied on God. They have tried to cry out to God. We see that in the Black experience here in North America, where these songs of freedom, the songs of the Negro spirituals, were songs sung not just to send messages, but literally were cries to God. Help me, Lord, and those types of things. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Those types of songs, and I think they're songs that has helped us to get over because they're coping mechanisms. And they kind of help us to get over some things and to deal with some things. I find that when I am burdened and pressed, the place I love to go to is just to the side of God, and whether it be through the medium of music or through the spoken word or whatever it is, it helps me to deal with mentally those things. How do you deal with in your context, in your personal context? How do you deal with the mental strain of some of these tragedies that affect us? Because whether they affect us directly or indirectly, we still have to deal with them mentally. Come to a place where we've put them in our minds a certain way so we can continue to live life and go on with life. How do you guys cope with some of these things?
Well, sorry. Go ahead, Myron.
No, I just quickly want to say, one thing you don't want to do is make it desensitize you, because the rate at which these things seem to be happening these days, it could just get to a place where it's just like, oh well, there's another one, and you just want to keep going, and that's not where we want to be. We want to remember that these are still human beings. These are injustices that they do not need to happen. They could be prevented if people would just take the time to see people as they would like to be seen.
Right. Do unto others, right? The concept of do unto others.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marsha.
I think the best tool that we have is education. When we learn who we are as a people, and when we learn, you mentioned the Bible and people using the Bible to keep people oppressed. When we learn who the authors of the Bible are, as you expressed, when we learn that so many characters in the Old Testament are actually Black people, when we look at even Jesus's lineage, remember when the Israelites conquered Jericho and Rahab helped the Israelite slaves. The Israelite people, the Israelite spies, not the slaves, the spies. But she helped them out, and her life was spared, right? And then she became a part of the Israelites. She married into that cultural group and became the great grandmother of David. And who does Jesus trace his lineage back to? David, right? So when we know that, and when we look at the New Testament and we see that, Christianity is not a religion of just white people. On the day of Pentecost, when the disciples were speaking in tongues, there were people from African nations who were there and took Christianity back to them. So we recognize that this is our religion as well, and God is our God, and Jesus is our God, and that gives us value as human beings, and that gives us value as people. So whatever oppression is coming our way is from people who themselves are not educated. So we need to educate ourselves, educate our children, so that we feel value. We also need not to buy into what the general culture is selling us, as to telling us who we are as a people. I had a student we have awards at school, and I'll just make this really quick. And so when they get awards for certain subjects and things like that, we go to the assembly, and then we come back to class. I would go through the program and really big up all the students in my class who won awards. So I was doing this one day, and I mentioned this girl, and she'd won a math award, and I made a huge deal out of it, just like I was for all the other students in my class who had won awards. Now, she was one Black student that I had in the class. I had other Black students, but she was the one Black person out of the whole group who had won awards. She came to me afterwards, and she was very upset with me. She was angry with me because I had made a big deal about her winning the math award. She didn't want anyone to know that she'd won the math award because it wasn't cool. Black people don't win math awards, and it just wasn't a cool thing for her. Where did she get that from? She thought it was okay if I made a big deal about all the Indian kids in the class, or the white kids in the class who won an award, but she didn't want to be called out in that way. She wanted to be known for her dancing. So we are letting another group of people tell us who we should be. And we need to educate ourselves and know that a lot of I'm gonna have to stop because I'm getting excited. We need to educate ourselves so that we can embrace who we truly are as a people, not let other people tell us who we're supposed to be as a people.
Thank you, Marsha. Alanna, saw your hand up. Go ahead.
Just to answer the question about what we do, personally, I think lately with everything that's going on, what I do is, first of all, have a big cry. Like, sometimes you just gotta let it out, and I just break down for a while, and then going off what Marsha said is I educate myself, because things are happening in the world, but I think that we do need to know why they're happening, how they're happening, and how we can make a difference and how we can change it. And I think that's one big thing that I've learned, especially this year, is that we really just need to educate ourselves on what's happening so we can make a difference. As well as music does help. Music in my shower. I sound amazing.
Can I just add really quickly, because I know we're looking at time, but we really also need to talk about this. We need to continue to have the conversation with one another. We need to find someone that we trust and that we know care or invest in us and what we do. Really reach out to people and talk about how you're feeling and what's going through your mind. If there's anything conflicting or anything like that, we need to be vigilant and pray and find time to just meditate, right? And don't sit with it by yourself, because I think that's what, you start having all these chatter that's going on, right? And that's how you could be misguided. Really, sit with it, but sit with someone and talk about it and nurture yourself afterwards.
Yeah, I saw a question pop up on the screen just now, asked by somebody. It's like, how does the Black Lives Matter movement fit into all this, or how does Black Lives Matter fit into all of this narrative? It's a great question, and thank you, Crystal, for that question. It's a great question, and one thing we have to realize is that there's a difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and what Black Lives Matter as a statement means in this current context. The Black Lives Matter organization, which has their own agenda and their own things, and that's fine. But there's also, I think overall, the phrase Black Lives Matter has taken on even much more of a meaning than just the organization itself. It's taken on a meaning that, look, stop ignoring Black lives. I saw a comedic skit the other day where they were doing this juxtaposition between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And so the Black person said, well, okay, he said, I agree with you. All lives do matter, which means then that my life currently matters, and therefore you need to be concerned about my life. And so it's a great way to look at it. But I think that as we take up the fight against the issues of social justice, against the issues of the legacy of racism, against the things that are happening around us, that are being perpetrated against people of ethnicity, because it's not just blacks, it's people of ethnicity, and all of that. We have to remember that the phrase Black Lives Matter means stop making me feel as if I don't belong, as if I'm not in this place, as if I'm not existing. Stop treating me as if I'm a second-class citizen. Remember that I too have rights. And I think that is the cry. And this, anybody that tries to associate the phrase only with the organization, I think is doing a disservice to the current context that we live in. Because it's much more than that. Do all lives matter? Of course they do. God, I think appreciates all lives. But at the end of the day, it is the injustices against people of color that has caused this much of a reaction. And when you see overt expressions of crimes being perpetrated against anyone of color, we have to say the phrase Black lives do matter. Lives that are not your skin color do matter. And you cannot just think that you are superior to everybody. And I think that is the message that we're getting across. And that has to be spoken, because even the legislation that is being enacted in these countries, we have to make sure that they're inclusive of all people and not just designed to be against some individuals. It is no secret that because of legislation, blacks make up the majority of the population in our prison systems. It is no secret when legislation is enacted that blacks and minority groups are pushed to live in certain areas and they can't go to other places. The system is designed to keep others down. And I have this strong personal belief that anyone who puts others down to elevate themselves really is the most flawed of all, because you have to put somebody else down to make yourself feel better. That's a problem in itself. Whether that is societally, nationally, or individually, that still is a problem. And we cannot climb on the backs of others who have not knelt down so we can go up. We have to all together reach together and help each other. We can't be crabs in a barrel. We have to be able to help each other rise above. And so I wanted to make sure I said that, because this statement of Black Lives Matter is important to this current generation. And using the phrase does not necessarily mean that you're in support of the organization as much as it means more that you are in support of the fact that I matter, and that anybody of color matters in this climate and day and age. And so I wanted to make sure I stated that, because it was a great question that was asked by Crystal, and I wanted to make sure we answered that. I would love to discuss this all day long. I would love to sit here with you guys all day long. I find you all very, very interesting. And I find you all appealing to speak to. It was nice to see some of you again. It's nice to meet some of you for the first time. Quincy and Myron, it's good to make your acquaintance and recognize your intelligence as you contributed on the show. Sharon and Marsha, we thank you so much. Your words of wisdom and everything else that goes along with your contribution today. We appreciate it. And Alanna, keep your hair red. I like it. You look amazing with that. And don't listen, Alanna. One thing I wanted to say to you is, listen, you don't apologize for who you are, especially when you're in a climate that you're not comfortable with. Find a way to become the norm instead of always sticking out as a sore thumb. Just find a way to become the norm, not in that you change yourself to adapt to everybody else, but be who you are unapologetically. People will come to love you for who you are inside. And I think that was one of the movements, one of the things that Martin Luther King said, right? Be judged by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin or the representation of your culture. You are who you are, and we love you, and we hope that God, it will be with you, even though you live in Winnipeg. God bless you so much for that. But we appreciate you. Hurry home. We want to see you here soon. If you plan to come back home, we'd love to have you back home. You know that you were one of our young deaconesses. That was an amazing young lady. See, Marsha, she gave me the look. Don't tell the people that. but it's wonderful to have you all. We thank you so much for being with us, panelists, and those of you that have been watching. We thank you for your contributions to the show today. as we were present. I want to say a special shout out to Mr. Norman Brown, who's watching us all the way from Ottawa, because WestLINK is his absolute favorite program. Love you, Norman. Good to have you with us, watching with us today. Please, as you see scrolling across the screen at the bottom, join us for our AY this afternoon at 6:30 p.m. It's going to be on T-West at T-West AY on Instagram. And so we want to make sure that you're joining us for that. But we want to say thank you so much for joining. If you ever want to connect with us at the church, you see the handles there that you can connect with. You even see a phone number you can call. If you're on our YouTube channel, again, we encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe, because we want you to be a part of the T-West Nation. And get updates from us. Click the notification bell and get updates from us. And whenever we go live, you'll be notified. We thank you so much for joining us and being with us this afternoon. May God richly bless you as you continue to enjoy his Sabbath day. And we'll see you soon on another WestLINK program. Be blessed, everybody.
No justice! Police! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice!
As outrage spreads over the killing of George Floyd in the U.S., protesters have taken to the streets around the world. Thousands of demonstrators gathered in London to protest against racism and discrimination.
Rarely have protests over deaths in custody drawn so many Australians. Tens of thousands rallied in Australian cities, great and small. In Brazil, demonstrators have been raising their voices against the killing of black people. In Mexico, we're here in support of the great uprising of the black people and of all colors for the crime against George Floyd committed by big policemen of the United States. This movement is not just about showing outrage at the death of African-American George Floyd in the US. The Black Lives Matter movement has unleashed a wave of protests against racism worldwide. Demonstrations are continuing this weekend, with protests held in East Asia and large crowds expected in European cities.